No fire, no food, no hope. The blizzard has been raging for 6 days now, and the Caldwell family huddles together in their one-room cabin as the temperature plummets to 20 below zero. Outside, the wind howls like a living thing, driving snow through every crack in the walls and burying their woodpile under 8 feet of drifts. Their last piece of firewood burned out 2 days ago. The food ran out yesterday morning. Sarah looks at her 3 children, ages 4, 7, and 9, and sees the hollow look of hunger beginning to settle in their eyes. This is the moment when most frontier families died, when the normal systems of survival failed completely, when death seemed inevitable. But Thomas doesn't panic. He learned the hard lessons of frontier survival from his father, who survived the brutal winter of 1856 when an early blizzard trapped his family for 3 weeks without adequate supplies. Thomas knows that families who survived these ordeals didn't do it through luck. They did it through knowledge, preparation, and techniques that could sustain human life even when everything seemed hopeless. This knowledge separated the families who lived to tell their stories from those who became grim statistics in frontier mortality records. When the normal systems of survival failed, when the fire went out and the food ran out, experienced frontier families had backup systems that could keep them alive for weeks using nothing but their knowledge and whatever materials they could find. The ability to survive without fire or food wasn't just about enduring hardship. It was about understanding human physiology, recognizing emergency food sources, creating heat without fuel, and maintaining hope when death seemed inevitable. How did frontier families generate life-sustaining heat without fire or fuel? What emergency food sources could they find even in the depths of winter? Which survival techniques could sustain entire families for weeks when their normal systems failed? And how did they maintain the psychological strength needed to survive when hope seemed lost? Today, we're exploring the desperate but ingenious methods that frontier families used to survive weeks without food or fire. Techniques that saved thousands of lives during the most brutal periods in American frontier history. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. The survival of frontier families during extreme deprivation required a combination of physiological knowledge, resource identification, improvisation skills, and psychological resilience that went far beyond normal pioneer capabilities. These techniques represented the difference between life and death when normal survival systems completely failed. Body heat conservation, creating warmth without fire or fuel. Thomas Caldwell gathers his family into the smallest room of their cabin and begins implementing the heat conservation techniques that his father taught him. Every action is deliberate, every decision based on understanding how the human body generates, retains, and loses heat in extreme conditions. The first priority is creating a microenvironment that can trap and amplify the family's natural body heat. Thomas moves the family into the cabin's interior corner, the area farthest from exterior walls and most protected from wind infiltration. This location provides the best foundation for heat conservation techniques. The layering system development was critical for maximizing the effectiveness of available clothing and bedding. Frontier families learned to create insulation systems using multiple thin layers rather than single thick layers, trapping air between layers to create effective insulation even with limited materials. The shared body heat techniques took advantage of the fact that multiple people could generate more heat together than individually. Families learned to sleep in close physical contact, sharing body heat through direct skin contact and shared breathing spaces that warmed the air they breathed. The breathing heat recovery methods captured and reused the heat from exhaled breath. Families learned to create enclosed spaces around their heads and upper bodies that trapped warm exhaled air, creating warmer microclimates that could raise the effective temperature by several degrees. The insulation material improvisation used whatever materials were available to create effective insulation barriers. Clothing, bedding, paper, straw, and even animal hair could be used to create insulation layers that trapped body heat and prevented heat loss to the environment. The shelter modification techniques reduced the volume of space that needed to be heated by body heat alone. Families learned to create smaller enclosed spaces within their cabins, using blankets, clothing, and furniture to create heat-retaining enclosures that concentrated their body heat. The activity and exercise protocols generated additional body heat through controlled physical activity. Families learned to perform exercises and movements that increased circulation and heat generation without consuming excessive energy or causing sweating that could lead to dangerous heat loss. The circulation maintenance techniques prevented frostbite and hypothermia by keeping blood flowing to extremities. Families learned massage techniques, movement patterns, and positioning methods that maintained circulation even during extended periods of cold exposure. The clothing management strategies maximized the heat retention properties of available clothing. This included techniques for drying wet clothing using body heat, creating additional insulation layers, and managing clothing to prevent heat loss while maintaining mobility and function. The sleep positioning methods optimized heat sharing and retention during rest periods. Families learned specific sleeping arrangements and positions that maximize shared body heat while ensuring that everyone could rest effectively despite cold conditions. The psychological heat techniques used mental strategies to help family members cope with cold and maintain the will to survive. Understanding that much of cold tolerance was psychological, experienced families used storytelling, singing, and other mental activities to distract from discomfort and maintain morale. The emergency warming protocols provided techniques for rewarming family members who showed signs of hypothermia or frostbite. These techniques used shared body heat and specific warming methods that could reverse dangerous cooling without access to external heat sources. The duration management strategies helped families pace their heat conservation efforts over extended periods. Understanding that these techniques required energy and attention, families learned to manage their efforts to maintain effectiveness over days or weeks of cold exposure. By 1860, frontier families had developed sophisticated heat conservation techniques that could sustain life even during extended periods without fire or fuel. These methods represented a deep understanding of human physiology and heat transfer principles that could mean the difference between survival and death during extreme weather events. Emergency food procurement, finding sustenance. When stores are empty. With the immediate heat crisis managed, Thomas turns his attention to the equally critical problem of finding food for his family. The normal food stores are exhausted, but he knows that even in the depths of winter, emergency food sources exist for those who know where to look and how to prepare them safely. Emergency food procurement during frontier crises required understanding which materials could provide essential nutrition, how to prepare potentially dangerous food safely, and how to maximize the nutritional value of minimal food sources. These techniques could sustain families for weeks when normal food supplies were exhausted. The bark and cambium harvesting techniques provided carbohydrates and some nutrients from tree bark. Certain trees, particularly birch, aspen, and pine, had inner bark layers that could be processed into edible material. The key was knowing which trees were safe, how to harvest the bark without killing the tree, and how to prepare it for consumption. The root and tuber identification allowed families to find underground food sources even during winter months. Certain roots remain viable under snow and frozen ground, providing essential carbohydrates and nutrients. Families learned to identify the above-ground signs of edible roots and techniques for extracting them from frozen ground. The seed and nut recovery involved finding stored food sources that animals had cached for winter. Squirrels, chipmunks, and other animals created food caches that could be located and harvested during emergencies. This required understanding animal behavior and the signs that indicated hidden food stores. The preserved food recovery techniques involved finding and utilizing food that had been naturally preserved by cold, drying, or other environmental conditions. This included frozen meat from animal carcasses, naturally dried berries and fruits, and other foods that remained edible despite being exposed to harsh conditions. The leather and hide consumption provided emergency protein and nutrients from leather goods, rawhide, and other processed animal materials. While not ideal food sources, these materials could be processed into edible form and provided essential nutrients during starvation conditions. The bone and marrow extraction techniques recovered valuable nutrients from animal bones that might otherwise be discarded. Bone marrow provided essential fats and proteins, while bones themselves could be processed into broths that provided nutrients and helped stretch other food sources. The plant material processing involved preparing normally inedible plant materials for consumption. This included techniques for removing toxins from potentially poisonous plants, processing fibrous plant materials to extract nutrients, and preparing plant materials to maximize their nutritional value. The portion control and rationing strategies maximized the survival value of limited food sources. Families learned to distribute small amounts of food to maintain energy and morale while stretching supplies over extended periods. This required understanding human nutritional needs and the psychology of hunger. The preparation and cooking techniques made emergency foods more palatable and digestible. Even without fire, families could use body heat, solar heating, and other methods to warm and prepare foods. Proper preparation also helped remove toxins and improve the nutritional availability of emergency foods. The water procurement methods ensured adequate hydration even when normal water sources were frozen or inaccessible. This included techniques for melting snow and ice using body heat, finding liquid water sources during winter, and purifying questionable water sources without fire. The digestive management techniques helped families adapt to unusual foods and limited quantities without causing digestive problems that could be dangerous during survival situations. This included understanding how to introduce new foods gradually and how to manage hunger and digestive discomfort. The psychological aspects of emergency eating addressed the mental challenges of consuming unpalatable or unusual foods. Families learned techniques for overcoming food aversions, maintaining morale during hunger, and using food rituals to maintain family cohesion during crisis periods. The safety protocols prevented food poisoning and other problems that could be fatal during survival situations. Families learned to identify dangerous foods, test unknown foods safely, and recognize signs of food-related illness that required immediate attention. By 1880, frontier families had developed comprehensive emergency food procurement systems that could sustain life even when normal food sources were completely exhausted. These techniques represented detailed knowledge of local ecosystems and human nutrition that could provide the margin of survival during the most desperate circumstances. Shelter optimization, maximizing protection without external heat sources. As the third day without fire stretches into evening, Thomas focuses on optimizing their shelter to provide maximum protection from the elements using only the materials available within their cabin. Every modification is designed to create warmer microclimates and reduce heat loss without requiring external fuel sources. Shelter optimization during extreme conditions required understanding heat transfer, air movement, and insulation principles that could be applied using only materials available in typical frontier homes. These techniques could dramatically improve survival conditions even without fire or fuel. The draft elimination process involved identifying and sealing every source of cold air infiltration. Families learned to use clothing, bedding, paper, and other materials to seal cracks, gaps, and other openings that allowed cold air to enter their living space. Even small drafts could significantly reduce the effectiveness of body heat conservation. The space reduction techniques created smaller areas that could be heated more effectively by body heat alone. Families learned to use furniture, blankets, and other materials to create enclosed spaces within larger rooms, concentrating their body heat in areas small enough to be warmed by human heat generation. The insulation barrier construction involved creating additional insulation layers on walls, floors, and ceilings using available materials. Clothing, bedding, straw, paper, and other materials could be used to create insulation barriers that reduced heat loss to the exterior environment. The floor insulation methods prevented heat loss to cold floors and ground. Families learned to create insulation layers using rugs, clothing, straw, and other materials that provided barriers between their bodies and cold surfaces that could rapidly drain body heat. The ceiling heat retention techniques prevented warm air from escaping through roof areas. Understanding that warm air rises, families learned to create barriers and enclosures that trapped warm air at human level rather than allowing it to escape to unused upper areas of their shelters. The wind barrier creation protected living areas from wind-driven cold air infiltration. Families learned to position furniture, hang blankets, and create other barriers that deflected cold air currents and created calm air zones where body heat could be more effective. The moisture management techniques prevented condensation and humidity problems that could reduce insulation effectiveness and create dangerous conditions. Families learned to manage breathing moisture, prevent ice formation, and maintain dry conditions that preserve the effectiveness of insulation materials. The ventilation balance maintained adequate air quality while minimizing heat loss. Families learned to provide just enough ventilation to prevent carbon dioxide buildup and maintain breathable air while minimizing the loss of warm air to the exterior environment. The furniture arrangement optimization created more effective heat retention and living arrangements. Families learned to position beds, chairs, and other furniture to create heat-retaining enclosures, block cold air currents, and maximize the effectiveness of shared body heat. The bedding and clothing management maximized the insulation value of available textiles. This included techniques for layering bedding, sharing blankets effectively, and using clothing as additional insulation material while maintaining enough clothing for daily wear. The emergency heating techniques used non-fuel heat sources to provide additional warmth. This included using heated stones that had absorbed solar heat during the day, creating heat through friction, and using chemical heat sources like lime or other materials that generated heat through chemical reactions. The psychological comfort measures maintained morale and hope during extended shelter confinement. Families learned to create comfortable and organized living spaces that supported mental health and family cohesion during extended periods of confinement in small spaces. The health and hygiene maintenance ensured that families remained healthy during extended shelter periods. This included techniques for maintaining cleanliness, managing waste, and preventing illness that could be dangerous when medical help was not available. By 1890, frontier families had developed sophisticated shelter optimization techniques that could create livable conditions even during extended periods without external heat sources. These methods represented a deep understanding of building science and human comfort that could sustain families through the most severe weather conditions. Psychological survival, maintaining hope and family cohesion during crisis. On the seventh day without fire or adequate food, Thomas recognizes that the greatest threat to his family's survival may not be cold or hunger, but despair. He has seen families with adequate physical resources die because they lost the will to fight, while others survived impossible odds through sheer determination and mutual support. Psychological survival during extreme hardship required understanding human psychology, family dynamics, and leadership techniques that could maintain morale and cooperation when physical conditions seemed hopeless. These skills were often the deciding factor between families that survived and those that didn't. The leadership establishment created clear authority and decision-making structures that prevented panic and confusion during crisis situations. Families learned that survival required strong leadership that could make difficult decisions, maintain discipline, and provide direction when circumstances were chaotic and frightening. The routine maintenance preserved normal family structures and activities even during extreme conditions. Families learned to maintain regular schedules, continue educational activities for children, and preserve normal social interactions that provided psychological stability during crisis periods. The hope preservation techniques maintained optimism and future orientation even when conditions seemed hopeless. Families learned to focus on positive outcomes, plan for survival and recovery, and maintain belief in their ability to overcome current challenges through persistence and effort. The fear management strategies helped family members cope with terror and anxiety that could paralyze decision-making and action. Families learned techniques for acknowledging fear while preventing it from overwhelming rational thought and effective action during survival situations. The conflict resolution methods prevented family disputes and tensions from undermining survival efforts. Families learned to manage disagreements, maintain cooperation, and resolve conflicts quickly before they could damage family cohesion during critical periods. The storytelling and distraction techniques provided mental escape and entertainment that helped family members cope with discomfort and boredom during extended confinement. Families learned to use stories, songs, games, and other activities to maintain morale and provide psychological relief from survival stress. The goal-setting and planning activities gave family members concrete objectives and future orientation that maintained motivation and hope. Families learned to set achievable short-term goals and plan for long-term recovery that provided purpose and direction during survival ordeals. The mutual support systems ensured that all family members received emotional support and encouragement during difficult periods. Families learned to recognize signs of despair and depression and to provide the emotional support needed to maintain everyone's will to survive. The spiritual and religious practices provided comfort and meaning during extreme hardship. Many families found that prayer, religious rituals, and spiritual beliefs provided strength and hope that sustained them through conditions that seemed beyond human endurance. The communication techniques maintained open dialogue and emotional connection between family members. Families learned to encourage expression of fears and concerns while maintaining positive communication that supported rather than undermined survival efforts. The celebration and gratitude practices found positive elements even in desperate situations. Families learned to celebrate small victories, express gratitude for what they had, and find moments of joy and connection even during the most difficult circumstances. The memory and legacy preservation helped families maintain connection to their past and future, even when the present seemed overwhelming. Families learned to share family history, discuss future plans, and maintain connection to their identity and values during crisis periods. The recovery planning activities prepared families for the transition back to normal life after survival ordeals. Families learned to plan for recovery, discuss lessons learned, and prepare for the psychological adjustment required when crisis conditions ended. "The body can endure what the mind cannot accept," wrote frontier survivor Martha Henderson in 1887. We learned that survival was not just about staying warm and finding food, it was about keeping our family together in spirit when everything else was falling apart. The families that survived were not necessarily the strongest or the best prepared, but the ones who refused to give up on each other. The techniques we've explored in videos like How Frontier Families Survived the Coldest Nights in the Wilderness and 7 Winter Survival Skills Every Frontier Family Knew demonstrate that the knowledge and skills developed by frontier families represent a complete system for surviving extreme hardship that goes far beyond physical techniques to include the psychological and social elements essential for human survival. The survival capabilities developed by frontier families prove that with knowledge, determination, and mutual support, families can survive conditions that seem impossible to endure. These techniques represent the ultimate test of human resilience and demonstrate that the bonds of family and community can provide the strength needed to overcome almost any challenge. The legacy of frontier family survival extends far beyond its historical importance. In an age of increasing uncertainty and potential crisis, the ability to maintain family cohesion and hope during extreme hardship represents valuable knowledge that remains relevant for anyone who values family resilience and preparedness. Out there in the wilderness, the rules were brutal: build shelter or die. The frontier was merciless. If a man wanted to survive, he needed more than courage. He needed the forgotten knowledge of those who came before him, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death when the elements turned savage. He needed shelters that could be built from nothing but what the land provided. Every technique mattered. One wrong choice, one forgotten method, and a man could freeze, drown, or find himself exposed to predators with nowhere to hide. Winter didn't care if you knew modern camping. Swamps didn't care if you had the latest gear. Storms didn't care if you followed the survival manual. The men who lasted knew the old ways. They knew the shelters that time forgot. What shelters did ancient peoples build that could save your life in terrain where modern techniques fail? Today we're exploring 7 forgotten survival shelters that kept our ancestors alive in the harshest conditions, techniques so effective they could save your life when everything else fails. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Number 1. The Half-Cave Shelter. The half-cave shelter was America's first lean-to. Long before European settlers arrived, Native American tribes across the continent had mastered the art of turning natural rock formations into life-saving refuges. This wasn't just camping, this was survival architecture that kept people alive for thousands of years. The technique was deceptively simple, but devastatingly effective. Overhanging cliffs, formed by the natural weathering of bluestone and limestone, created ready-made shelters that required minimal modification. The horizontal seams in these rock faces would split and fall away over centuries, aided by ice, rain, and the persistent roots of black birch and rock oak, until nature itself had quarried out spaces large enough to shelter a stooping man. But the real genius wasn't in finding these formations. It was in completing them. The original Americans would rest poles at an angle against the cliff face, creating a slanted wall that closed off the open side of the cave. Over these poles, they would layer balsam, pine, hemlock, or palmetto branches, always with the tips pointing downward to shed rain rather than collect it. This simple modification transformed a partial shelter into a weatherproof refuge. Archaeological evidence tells the story of just how effective these shelters were. Dig into the floor of any half-cave shelter in Pennsylvania or throughout the eastern states, and you'll unearth centuries of human habitation: pottery shards, mussel shells, bone awls, flint arrowheads, split bones from large game animals, and the charred wood of countless campfires. The Iroquois used these shelters so extensively that some sites show continuous occupation spanning generations. The half-cave shelter worked because it solved the fundamental problem of wilderness survival: maximum protection with minimum effort. In an emergency situation, a man could have weatherproof shelter in under an hour, using nothing but materials found within a few hundred yards of the site. No tools required beyond a sharp stick or stone. No complex engineering, just the wisdom to recognize what nature had already provided and the knowledge to complete what she had started. The projecting ledges form half-caves from the falling apart of the lower layers of the cliff, large enough to shelter a stooping man. This wasn't primitive camping. This was survival science that kept entire cultures alive through the harshest winters the continent could deliver. Number 2. The Barabra. Along the brutal coastlines of the Bering Sea, where winds could kill a man in minutes and winter temperatures dropped to levels that would freeze exposed flesh in seconds, the Aleut people developed what might be the most sophisticated survival shelter ever created: the Barabra. This wasn't just a house, it was a masterpiece of Arctic engineering that could keep families alive through months of conditions that would destroy any modern structure. The Barabara was built like an underground fortress. Construction began with 8 short posts for the outer wall, planted about 3 feet above ground, and 6 to 8 longer posts for interior support. The tops of these posts were cut wedge-shaped to fit precisely into notched crossbeams. This wasn't random construction. Every joint was engineered to lock together under the immense weight of the structure above. The real genius was in the shape. When viewed from above, the completed frame formed a hexagon like a boy's kite, with the front wider than the back. This design wasn't aesthetic, it was aerodynamic. The shape deflected the savage Arctic winds that could tear apart conventional shelters. The crosslogs were notched like those of a log cabin, but instead of building up, they built in, creating a dome-like structure that grew stronger under pressure. But the most critical feature was the entrance. Instead of a simple doorway that would let in deadly cold air, the Barabara featured a long, low tunnel entrance that forced anyone entering to crawl. This wasn't inconvenience, it was thermal engineering. Cold air, being heavier than warm air, would settle in the tunnel while the warm air remained trapped in the living space above. The entrance acted as a natural airlock, maintaining the interior temperature even in the most extreme conditions. The entire structure was then covered with splits, shakes, or whatever materials were available: birch bark, spruce bark, even sod and earth. The thick covering, sometimes over a foot deep, provided insulation that could maintain livable temperatures inside even when the outside air was cold enough to kill. For ventilation, a single hole in the roof served as both chimney and air exchange, carefully sized to prevent heat loss while allowing smoke to escape. This system was so effective that families could survive entire Arctic winters in comfort, with interior temperatures remaining above freezing even when outside temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. The Barabara represents the pinnacle of survival architecture, a shelter so perfectly adapted to its environment that it could sustain human life in conditions where exposure meant death in minutes. Number 3. The bog ken. In the treacherous marshlands and swamps where solid ground was a myth and every step could mean sinking into bottomless mud, early American settlers developed a shelter that defied the laws of physics: the bog ken. This elevated refuge solved a problem that stumped even experienced woodsmen: how to build a stable shelter on ground that couldn't support the weight of a man, let alone a structure. The bog ken was engineering genius born from desperation. The foundation wasn't built on the ground, it was built above it, using a principle borrowed from snowshoes. The builders would first create a thick mattress of twigs and branches, carefully layered in alternating directions, like a massive woven mat. This mattress distributed the weight of the entire structure across a wide surface area, preventing it from sinking into the soft marsh below. The construction technique was precise and unforgiving. The first course of sticks was laid in one direction, then the next course at perfect right angles to the first, and so on, building up a foundation that could be several feet thick. Standing on this mattress, builders could then force sharpened posts down into the yielding mud below, but only far enough to make them stand upright. Push too far, and they disappear into the bottomless muck forever. The shelter itself was built on a platform above this foundation, using a series of arches similar to Iroquois longhouse construction. The uprights on both sides had their ends bent over and lashed together, forming curved ribs that could flex with wind and weather without breaking. Over these arches, horizontal poles were lashed to create a framework that could be thatched with whatever materials were available. But the bog ken had features that went beyond basic shelter. Tin pans with holes in the bottom were slid over the supporting poles to prevent varmints, rats, snakes, and other creatures from climbing up into the living space. The elevated position also provided natural protection from mosquitoes, which clung to the marsh grass below and rarely rose above it except in completely still air. The floor was made from halved logs, carefully fitted and covered with browse, hay, or rushes for comfort. A fireplace could be built by enclosing a bed of mud between 4 logs, creating a safe cooking and heating area that wouldn't ignite the structure. The bog ken is one that is built over boggy or marshy places too soft to support an ordinary structure. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a complete survival system that allowed people to live safely in terrain that would otherwise be uninhabitable. The bog ken proved that with the right knowledge, even the most hostile environments could be conquered. If you want to learn more about traditional survival techniques that conquered impossible terrain, check out our episode on 28 forgotten survival tricks that could save your life in the wild. Number 4. The fallen tree shelter. When darkness was falling and a man had nothing but the clothes on his back and maybe a knife, the fallen tree shelter could mean the difference between surviving the night and becoming another casualty of the wilderness. This technique was the ultimate emergency shelter, fast, effective, and requiring nothing more than what nature provided and a man's ability to recognize opportunity. The method was brutally simple, but required precise execution. The survivor would select a thick-foliaged fir tree, preferably one with dense branches that reached nearly to the ground. Using whatever cutting tool was available, a knife, hatchet, or even a sharp stone, he would cut partially through the trunk, just enough to weaken it so that it would fall in a controlled direction. The key was the partial cut. Too little, and the tree wouldn't fall. Too much, and it would crash unpredictably, potentially injuring the builder or destroying the very branches that would provide shelter. Once the tree was down, the real work began. The branches on the underside, the side that would become the floor, were trimmed away to create a space large enough for a man to lie down. This wasn't just clearing space, it was creating a natural mattress from the smaller branches and needles that were removed. The larger branches that remained formed the walls and partial roof of the shelter. The genius was in the next step, using the tree's own branches to complete the roof. The branches that had been trimmed from the top side of the fallen trunk were carefully arranged over the shelter, with their butt ends pointing upward and their tips pointing down toward the ground. This arrangement was critical. It created a natural shingling effect that would shed rain and snow rather than collecting it. The final layer was smaller browse, pine needles, small twigs, and any available vegetation, thatched over the larger branches to fill gaps and create a weatherproof barrier. When properly constructed, this shelter could keep a man dry and protected from wind in conditions that would otherwise be fatal. The fallen tree shelter worked because it solved multiple survival problems simultaneously. It provided immediate protection from the elements, created an insulated sleeping area using the tree's own needles and branches, and could be built in under an hour by a single person with minimal tools. The thick foliage of a properly selected tree could provide insulation equivalent to several blankets, while the natural oils in pine and fir needles helped repel insects. For a one-man, one-night stand, select a thick foliaged fir tree and cut it partly through the trunk so that it will fall. Then trim off the branches on the underside so as to leave room to make your bed beneath the branches. This wasn't a long-term solution. It was an emergency technique that could save a life when time was running out and options were few. In the hands of someone who understood the method, a single tree could become a complete survival shelter in the time it took the sun to set. Number 5. The Navajo Hogan. In the harsh deserts and mountains of the American Southwest, where temperatures could swing from scorching heat to deadly cold in a single day, the Navajo people perfected a shelter design that was both simple to build and incredibly effective: the Hogan. This wasn't just a house, it was a survival structure that could be adapted to virtually any environment and built with whatever materials the land provided. The traditional survival Hogan was a 6-sided dome structure that combined the stability of a log cabin with the strength of an arch. Construction began by laying out 6 walls in a hexagonal pattern, using the same notching techniques that would later be adopted by European settlers for their log cabins. But instead of building straight up, the Hogan builders angled each successive layer of logs inward, creating a dome shape that grew stronger as it rose. The engineering was sophisticated despite its apparent simplicity. Each log was carefully notched to fit snugly against its neighbors, creating joints that locked together under the weight of the structure above. As the walls curved inward, the logs became shorter, until finally the dome was completed with a small opening at the top for smoke to escape. This opening wasn't just functional, it was precisely sized to create proper ventilation while minimizing heat loss. The dome shape was critical to the Hogan's effectiveness. Unlike flat-roofed structures that could collapse under heavy snow loads or peaked roofs that created wind resistance, the curved dome distributed weight evenly and deflected wind from any direction. The structure was so stable that it could withstand the severe windstorms that regularly swept across the Southwest, storms that could destroy conventional buildings. But the real genius of the Hogan was its adaptability. In hot climates, the structure could be left uncovered or covered with brush to provide shade while allowing air circulation. In cold climates, the same basic structure could be covered with earth, sod, or thick layers of bark to create insulation that would maintain comfortable temperatures even in freezing weather. The central fire pit provided heat that was efficiently distributed throughout the dome-shaped interior. The entrance was another carefully engineered feature. Instead of a simple doorway, the Hogan featured a covered entrance passage that prevented direct wind and rain from entering the living space. This entrance could be extended into a full shed-like structure for additional protection in severe weather. The Navajo Hogan proved that effective shelter design wasn't about complexity. It was about understanding the fundamental principles of structural engineering and environmental adaptation. A properly built Hogan could house a family through multiple seasons, providing protection that was superior to many modern structures, while using only materials that could be gathered from the immediate environment. This one is six-sided and may be improved by notching the logs and building them up one on top of the other, dome-shaped to the required height. The Hogan represented thousands of years of refinement in shelter design, a structure so perfectly adapted to its environment that it remained virtually unchanged for centuries because it simply couldn't be improved upon. Number 6. The Scoutmaster Shelter. When a man found himself in the wilderness with no rope, no nails, and no complex tools, the Scoutmaster Shelter offered a solution that seemed to defy logic. A stable, weatherproof structure built from nothing but 3 forked sticks and whatever natural materials could be gathered in an hour. This technique represented the pinnacle of primitive engineering, maximum shelter with minimum resources. The foundation of the Scoutmaster Shelter was a tripod formed by 3 carefully selected forked sticks. But this wasn't random construction. The forks had to be precisely matched and interlocked in a specific way to create a self-supporting structure. The 3 forked ends were interlocked so that each fork held the other 2 in place, creating a joint that actually grew stronger under load. This interlocking system meant that the entire structure was held together by its own weight and the natural tension of the wood. The selection of the forked sticks was critical. They had to be strong enough to support the weight of the covering materials, flexible enough to bend slightly without breaking, and shaped so that the forks would interlock properly. Experienced builders could identify the right sticks at a glance, looking for specific angles in the forks and particular grain patterns in the wood that indicated strength and flexibility. Once the tripod was established, the framework was completed by resting additional poles against the 3 main supports, their butts forming a circle on the ground. These poles didn't need to be attached. They were held in place by gravity and the angle of their placement. The result was a cone-shaped framework that could support considerable weight while remaining flexible enough to move with wind and weather. The covering technique was where the real skill showed. Branches were placed with their butt ends pointing upward, creating a natural shingling effect that would shed water rather than collecting it. This wasn't intuitive. Most people would naturally place branches with their tips up, the way they grow. But the Scoutmaster technique reversed this, using the natural curve of the branches to create a surface that directed water away from the shelter. The final layer was smaller browse, pine needles, leaves, or any available vegetation, thatched over the larger branches to fill gaps and create a weatherproof barrier. When properly constructed, This shelter could keep multiple people dry and protected from wind in conditions that would make camping impossible. The Scoutmaster shelter could be scaled from a one-man emergency refuge to a structure large enough for several people. The same basic technique worked regardless of size, making it one of the most versatile survival shelters ever developed. It could be built in forest, prairie, or mountain environments using whatever materials were locally available. For more details on frontier construction methods that used nothing but natural materials, see our comprehensive guide, How Mountain Men Built Cabins, from Scratch, 1.5-hour compilation. Take 3 forked sticks and interlock the forked ends so that they will stand. Over this framework, rest branches with the butt ends up. The Scoutmaster shelter proved that sophisticated engineering didn't require sophisticated tools. It required sophisticated understanding of how natural materials could be combined to create structures that were stronger than the sum of their parts. Number 7. The log dugout. When the weather turned truly deadly, when tornadoes, blizzards, or extreme cold threatened to kill anyone caught above ground, early American settlers had one final refuge that could withstand conditions that would destroy any surface structure: the log dugout. This hybrid shelter combined the protection of an underground bunker with the structural strength of log construction, creating a refuge that could keep families alive through the worst disasters nature could deliver. The log dugout was built by excavating a rectangular pit into a hillside or bank, then constructing log cabin walls within the excavated space. This wasn't simple digging. The excavation had to be precisely sized and shaped to accommodate the log walls while providing proper drainage and structural support. The builders had to understand soil composition, water flow, and structural engineering to create a dugout that wouldn't collapse or flood. The log walls were built using the same notching techniques used in surface cabins, but with critical modifications for underground construction. Each log had to be carefully fitted, not just to the logs above and below it, but also to the earth walls of the excavation. The joints had to be tight enough to prevent soil from infiltrating the living space, while still allowing for the natural settling that occurred as the structure aged. The roof was the most critical element. Unlike surface structures that could use peaked roofs to shed water, the dugout required a flat roof that could support the weight of earth covering while still providing adequate protection from the elements. The roof was constructed from heavy logs laid close together, often with a larger log pegged to the rafters above the eaves to hold the sod covering in place. The earth covering wasn't just piled on randomly, it was carefully layered to create insulation and waterproofing. The first layer was often bark or other waterproof material, followed by progressively finer layers of soil, and finally sod with living grass that would grow and create a natural waterproof membrane. When properly constructed, the roof covering could be several feet thick, providing insulation that would maintain comfortable temperatures even in extreme cold. Ventilation was achieved through carefully placed openings that allowed air circulation while preventing heat loss. The entrance was often built as a separate structure or tunnel that prevented cold air from entering the main living space directly. Some dugouts featured multiple rooms connected by tunnels, creating underground complexes that could house extended families. The log dugout was so effective that it became the preferred shelter in areas prone to severe weather. Tornado Alley settlers built them as storm shelters that could withstand winds that would level surface buildings. Arctic explorers used similar techniques to create winter quarters that could maintain livable temperatures when surface temperatures dropped to lethal levels. The dugout represented the ultimate in survival architecture, a shelter that could protect human life in conditions where exposure meant certain death. It proved that when survival was at stake, the combination of underground protection and solid construction could create refuges that were virtually indestructible. To explore more about surviving harsh winter conditions with traditional techniques, check out How Frontiersmen Survived the Frozen Wilderness, 2-hour winter documentary.